Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of our special 10-year anniversary episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be presenting the second of our 4-part series about one of the most infamous crimes of all time, the Lindbergh Baby Kidnapping. We released part 1 last week, and if you haven't heard that episode yet, I suggest you go back and listen to it, since I shared a lot of information which will be relevant to what we're discussing today. As a brief recap, back when this crime took place, aviator Charles Lindbergh was perhaps the most famous individual in the United States after having completed the world's first solo transatlantic flight from New York to Paris nearly 5 years earlier. Charles and his wife Anne Morrill Lindbergh were living at their estate in East Amwell Township, New Jersey, with their 20-month-old son Charlie Lindbergh, but on the evening of March 1, 1932, Charlie was abducted from his second-floor nursery, and a makeshift wooden ladder was found at the scene, which the kidnapper likely used to enter the nursery and take the child from his crib. A ransom note was also left behind, in which the abductor demanded $50,000 for Charlie's safe return, and since the note was filled with spelling and grammatical errors, it was apparent that English was not the author's first language, and there was a good chance they might have been German. John Condon, a 71-year-old semi-retired educator from the Bronx, was a major admirer of Lindbergh, who was left horrified by the kidnapping of his son, so much so that he placed an ad in a Bronx newspaper volunteering to function as an intermediary for the Lindbergh family, even though he did not personally know them. Incredibly, the kidnapper answered Condon's ad and authorized him to act as a go-between, so Condon eventually met up with this person at a local cemetery and delivered the $50,000 ransom to a mysterious unidentified man with a thick accent known only as Cemetery John. But unfortunately, this did not lead to Charlie's safe return, and shortly thereafter, the baby's decomposed body was found in a wooded area just over 4 miles from the Lindbergh estate. His cause of death was determined to be a fractured skull, and it was theorized that Charlie died on the same night he was kidnapped, possibly when the perpetrator accidentally dropped him while climbing down the ladder from the nursery. Since the serial numbers for all the bills in the ransom were recorded before it was handed over to Cemetery John, the authorities were able to start tracking the money when it turned up in circulation. However, it would not be until September of 1934, 2.5 years after the kidnapping took place, when some of the bills were finally traced to Bruno Richard Hauptmann, a 34-year-old German immigrant who lived in the Bronx. And when we left off on our last episode, Hauptmann had just been taken into custody, and over $14,000 of the ransom money was discovered hidden inside his garage. Of course, that sounds pretty damning, but Hauptmann denied any involvement in the kidnapping and had his own explanation for how this money wound up in his possession. On today's episode, we're going to discuss the evidence against Hauptmann, as well as the circumstances of his eventual trial and execution. So without any further ado, let us now present part 2 of our series about the Lindbergh Baby Kidnapping.
Where am I? I've got to find land, somewhere, before my gas is gone.
So we're going to start off by delving into the background of our prime suspect, 34-year-old Bruno Richard Hauptmann. Hauptmann went by his middle name, as his wife would claim that she didn't even know that his given first name was Bruno until after he was arrested. Hauptmann originally hailed from the town of Kamenz, Germany, and in 1917, he experienced a series of major tragedies when 2 of his brothers were killed while fighting in World War I, and his father died of natural causes. Hauptmann himself served in World War I and wound up surviving, but since it was difficult to obtain employment in Germany following the war, he turned to crime. There was an incident where Hauptmann and one of his friends robbed a pair of women in order to steal their food coupons, but while some versions of the story report that these women were pushing baby carriages, it sounds like that part is a bit exaggerated, as there were no babies actually present at the scene, and the carriages were just being used as shopping carts. Hauptmann also committed a few burglaries, and interestingly enough, one of them involved him using a ladder to break into the home of the town mayor. Hauptmann and his friend were eventually arrested and convicted of a total of 4 robberies and received 5-year prison sentences. Hauptmann was paroled in March of 1923, but in June of that year, he was rearrested for attempting to sell stolen property. However, he soon managed to escape from jail and attempted to flee Germany by stowing away on an ocean liner to New York City. After he arrived at Ellis Island, Hauptmann was immediately arrested and deported, but it wasn't long before he stowed away on another ocean liner and made another unsuccessful attempt to enter the United States. In November of that year, Hauptmann stowed away on an ocean liner to New York for the 3rd time, but he finally managed to slip into the country and settled into the Bronx, where he received protection from an established member of the German community and wound up making a new living as a carpenter, even though he was technically in the United States illegally. 2 years after his arrival, Hauptmann married a German waitress named Anna Schofler, and they had their first child, a son named Manfred, in 1933. At this particular point, the Hauptmanns are living in the rented 2nd-floor apartment of a house located at 1279 East 222nd Street in the Yorkville neighborhood of the Bronx. When we left off on our last episode, it was September the 19th, 1934, and Hauptmann had just been taken into custody by police after he recently purchased gasoline with a $10 gold certificate which had the serial numbers from one of the bills used in the Lindbergh ransom payment. The authorities soon performed a search of Hauptmann's apartment and a nearby garage that he had helped construct, and they wound up discovering a total of $14,600 in cash, which had been stored behind some boards and inside a shellac can in the garage, and all the bills contained serial numbers from the ransom. Prior to this, $5,100 worth of ransom money had been discovered in circulation after having been spent at various locations over the course of 2.5 years. Combined with the money from Hauptmann's garage, this meant that a total of $19,700 had been recovered, but $30,300 was still unaccounted for. In addition to the money, a loaded 3-inch Lilliput pistol was also found concealed inside a hole in the garage. Hauptmann was taken to the police station for interrogation, and he did not have a lawyer present. He denied any involvement in the kidnapping and murder of Charlie Lindbergh, but was asked to provide an alibi for 3 specific dates. On Tuesday, March the 1st, 1932, the date of the kidnapping, Hauptmann believed that he spent the day working his new job as a carpenter at the Majestic Apartments in the Bronx until 5 p.m. His wife Anna worked as a waitress at a bakery/cafe called Frederickson's, and Hauptmann said that it had been common practice for him to pick up his wife there every Tuesday night at 9 p.m. when her shift ended. On that particular night, he recalled taking the bakery owner's dog for a walk while Anna chatted with a female customer before he drove her home. Hauptmann was then asked to provide an alibi for the evening of Saturday, April 2, 1932, the same night that Dr. John Condon had met up with the mysterious cemetery John at St. Raymond's Cemetery in the Bronx and gave him the $50,000 ransom. Hauptmann recalled returning home from work at 6 p.m. that night, and on the first Saturday of every month, he would usually be visited at his apartment by his best friend, Hans Kloppenberg. This would be their annual music night, where the two men would play the guitar and the mandolin and sing German songs together, and Hauptmann said that Kloppenberg showed up at around 7 p.m. and left sometime between 11:30 and midnight. Anna Hauptmann would later verify both of these alibis, and Kloppenberg confirmed that he was at their apartment playing music on the night of the ransom drop. Investigators are also curious about Hauptmann's whereabouts on the evening of November 26, 1933, as one of the ransom bills had been used to purchase a movie ticket at Lowe's Sheridan Square Theater in Greenwich Village, and when the cashier, Cecile Barr, provided a description of the man who paid her, he seemed to resemble Hauptmann. Well, November the 26th happened to be Hauptmann's birthday, so both he, his wife, and 2 other witnesses claimed that they held a party to celebrate the occasion in his apartment that night and denied he was anywhere near Lowe's Sheridan Square Theater. When Hauptmann was first taken into custody, he had a $20 gold certificate with a serial number from the ransom in his possession, but claimed this was the only gold certificate he had and denied having any more of them in his residence. At the time, the $14,600 had not yet been found at Hauptmann's garage, but the bills all turned out to be gold certificates. When confronted about this, Hauptmann still continued to deny any involvement in the kidnapping, but admitted that he had lied about having this money and came up with a very surprising alternate explanation for why it was in his possession. According to Hauptmann, the gold certificates had originally been given to him by a former friend named Isidor Fish, who also happened to be a German immigrant and had worked as a fur cutter. Fish had previously convinced Hauptmann to invest money with them and became his business partner, as they would split the profits from Fish's fur business and their stock market investments. On December 6, 1933, Fish left on a vacation to visit his family in his hometown of Leipzig, Germany, and Hauptmann held a farewell party for him at his apartment. Hauptmann claimed that Fish showed up there with a shoebox which was wrapped in string and told him it contained some very important papers, so he asked Hauptmann if he would hold on to it while he was away in Germany. Hauptmann said he agreed to the request and placed the box on the top shelf of a broom closet inside his kitchen. Fish soon left on his trip, but he never returned, as over 3 months later, Hauptmann received a letter from Fish's family in Germany informing him that Fish had died of tuberculosis on March 29, 1934, at the age of 28. Hauptmann maintained that he had completely forgotten about the shoebox Fish gave him and only found it again in August of 1934 when it rained and he noticed there was a leak in the ceiling of the broom closet. When Hauptmann recovered the box and opened it, he was shocked to discover over $14,000 in there, and since many of the bills had been soaked by the leak, he took the money out to the garage in order to wrap the bills in bundles of newspaper in order to dry them. Since the bills were all gold certificates, and the United States had made it illegal to hoard these certificates the previous year, Hauptmann claimed he elected not to notify the authorities, as he feared he might be fined, imprisoned, or even deported, since he was technically in the country illegally. He also did not tell his wife about the money and started spending some of it, which is what led to him being arrested after he used a $10 gold certificate to purchase gasoline 1 month later. According to Hauptmann, he had realized that Fish was a con artist who had a habit of borrowing money from friends to invest in firms which did not exist. Hauptmann claimed that he loaned Fish $5,500 to trade and invest in some fur pelts, but Fish had convinced Hauptmann to do this by showing him receipts which turned out to be counterfeit, as Fish never actually had these fur pelts in his possession. In addition, Fish had borrowed $2,000 from Hauptmann to pay for his trip to Germany and purchase some additional furs overseas, so at the time of his death, he owed Hauptmann a total of $7,500. In Hauptmann's eyes, he felt this provided justification for him to hold on to the shoebox full of money that Fish had left with them, but he maintained that he never spent any of the ransom money which showed up in circulation prior to August of 1934. Naturally, the authorities were quite skeptical of Hauptmann's story, but one detail that did check out is that the newspapers which had been used to wrap the money were all dated from the summer of 1934, and none of them were dated from 1932, when the ransom drop originally took place. In order to compare Hauptmann's handwriting to the writing from the 14 ransom notes which had been sent following the kidnapping, investigators devised a test in which they would dictate passages from the original notes and asked Hauptmann to write them out. The police felt that his writing looked very similar, so they sent the samples to Albert S. Osborne, who was considered to be the foremost handwriting expert in the United States. After viewing the samples and comparing them to the ransom notes, Osborne concluded that Hauptmann likely wrote them and was the sole author of the notes. Since Dr. John Condon had 2 separate meetings with the mysterious Cemetery John and had given him the ransom money, he was brought to the police station to view a lineup of suspects to see if he could identify Hauptmann. When Dr. Condon looked at Hauptmann, he thought there was a possibility that he could have been Cemetery John, particularly after he heard Hauptmann speak in his thick German accent, but he could not be 100% certain it was the same man. Condon even asked the police if he could have a private conversation with Hauptmann, but even after the 2 men spoke, Condon said he could not make a positive identification. He told the police, quote, He resembles the man. I can see a resemblance, but I cannot swear to it." End quote. Now, when the ransom drop took place, Charles Lindbergh himself had driven Condon to St. Raymond Cemetery to hand over the money, but remained in the car while the exchange took place. Lindbergh claimed that he never got a look at Cemetery John's face, but he did overhear John yell out the words, quote, hey doctor, over here," at Condon. Lindbergh was brought into the Manhattan District Attorney's office in order to meet Hauptmann, but even though he did not recognize his face, Hauptmann was ordered to say the words, hey doctor, over here," several times. Lindbergh ultimately felt that he could not say with 100% certainty that this was Cemetery John's voice. Regardless, the authorities still believed that Hauptmann was the right man. Even though the United States had enacted the Federal Kidnapping Act in order to make it a federal offense to transport kidnapping victims over state lines, Hauptmann could not be prosecuted under this statute since it was not yet in effect at the time Charlie Lindbergh was abducted. But on September the 24th, 5 days after his arrest, Hauptmann was officially indicted by the Bronx Supreme Court for extortion. Since Hauptmann's collection of the ransom money had taken place in the Bronx, the extortion charge was technically under their jurisdiction. While Charlie's body had technically been found in Mercer County, New Jersey, the authorities believed that the child's actual death took place on the grounds of the Lindbergh estate, which was located in Hunterdon County. As a result, a murder case against Hauptmann would be presented in front of a Hunterdon County grand jury, and he would be held at the Hunterdon County Jail in Flemington. Even though John Condon had initially been reluctant to identify Hauptmann as Cemetery John, he agreed to interview him in the Hunterdon County Jail. After their meeting concluded, Condon had changed his mind and said he was now convinced that Hauptmann was the man he saw and agreed to testify to this in front of the grand jury. Interestingly enough, Condon would later look at a photograph of Isidore Fish and claim that he saw a man resembling Fish near Woodlawn Cemetery right before his first meeting with Cemetery John, but this information was never presented at trial. On October the 8th, the grand jury proceedings concluded, and Hauptmann was officially indicted on the charge of first-degree murder. New York Governor Herbert Lehman agreed to allow Hauptmann to be extradited to New Jersey to face the murder charge, and he would remain incarcerated at the Hunterdon County Jail to await trial. The case would be prosecuted by New Jersey Attorney General David Wilentz, and in exchange for the exclusive rights to publish Hauptmann's story in their newspaper, the New York Evening Journal agreed to cover his legal costs. Edward J. Riley was hired to be Hauptmann's defense attorney, but even though he was one of the biggest criminal lawyers in Brooklyn and had never lost an important case, he was known for being a heavy drinker at the time, and there was concern that this would affect his performance at the trial. In fact, just 2 years later, Riley's mental health had declined so much that he wound up being committed to an insane asylum due to the effects of tertiary syphilis. By contrast, Riley's associate defense counsel, Lloyd Fisher, seemed very much devoted to Hauptmann's case and never stopped believing in his client's innocence until the very end. The trial began at the Hunterdon County Courthouse in Flemington on January 2, 1935, and was presided over by Judge Thomas Whitaker Trenchard, who allowed news cameras into the courtroom to record the event. It would be dubbed the trial of the century, while Hauptmann was referred to as the quote-unquote most hated man in America, and journalist H.L. Mencken classified the whole thing as the quote-unquote biggest story since the resurrection. About 60,000 people traveled to Flemington to attend the trial, but since Flemington was a small town with a population of around 2,700 and only had one hotel, some of the local residents made money by renting out rooms at their homes. While most of the crowds who showed up were forced to remain outside, scalpers actually went so far as to sell reserved seats inside the courtroom for the trial, and the Hunterdon County Sheriff became the center of some controversy once it came out that he was collecting a surcharge on the sale of these seats. Charles Lindbergh attended every single day of the trial, but 1 month earlier, on December 3, 1934, his family suffered yet another tragedy when Anne Lindbergh's older sister, Elizabeth Morrow Morgan, died at the age of 30 after contracting pneumonia following an emergency appendectomy. So I just mentioned that even though John Condon failed to positively identify Hauptmann as Cemetery John when he looked at him in a police lineup, he changed his mind before the trial began, and when he took the witness stand, he once again identified Hauptmann as the man he had interacted with during the ransom drop. However, there would be additional controversy when Charles Lindbergh took the stand. As you might recall, when Lindbergh first heard Hauptmann utter the words, "Hey, doctor," he said he couldn't be certain that this was the same voice he heard on the night of the ransom drop. When Lindbergh took the stand to testify at the Bronx County grand jury proceedings when Hauptmann was indicted for extortion, he said, quote, "It would be very difficult for me to sit here and say that I could pick a man by that voice," end quote. But when Lindbergh testified at the Hunterdon County grand jury proceedings when Hauptmann was indicted for murder, he had changed his mind and positively identified Hauptmann's voice as that of Cemetery John's. And when he took the stand at Hauptmann's trial, he made the same identification. At the time, Lindbergh had so much credibility that some of the jurors would later say that his testimony was pretty much the key factor that cemented their opinion about Hauptmann's guilt, and nothing presented at the trial from that moment on was going to change their minds. Additional testimony was provided by John Joseph Perrone, the New York taxi driver who had been paid $1 by a stranger to deliver an envelope containing instructions to Dr. Condon's address on the night of his first meetup with Cemetery John at Woodlawn Cemetery. When he took the stand, Perrone positively identified Hauptmann as the man who had given him the envelope. The prosecution also produced some eyewitnesses who claimed they had seen Hauptmann near the Lindbergh estate in East Amwell Township prior to the kidnapping. One of these witnesses was Millard Whitehead, who claimed that in mid-February of 1932, there were two separate incidents which took place 1 week apart when he was driving down the road and saw a stranger near the Lindbergh property. Whitehead was convinced that he had seen the same man both times and positively identified him as Hauptmann. To counter this, the defense presented testimony by 3 men from Amwell Township who attempted to poke holes in Whitehead's credibility by claiming he had a terrible reputation in the community for being a liar and a cheat. On March 1st, 1932, the morning of the kidnapping, a witness named Amanda Hochmuth had reported having seen a dark green Dodge sedan erratically driving down the road near the Lindbergh estate before it nearly crashed into a ditch. Hauptmann owned a blue Dodge sedan, and vehicle records showed that it had been registered as being green at the end of 1931, but was painted blue by the end of 1932. Hochmuth said he noticed what appeared to be the sections of a ladder inside the sedan before it drove away, and when he took the witness stand, he identified Hauptmann as the driver. But Hochmuth was 84 years old when his sighting took place and suffered from cataracts. In fact, state records showed that shortly after the kidnapping, he applied for welfare and wound up receiving it because he was classified as being nearly legally blind. Needless to say, the defense did not believe that Hochmuth's eyesight was strong enough for his identification to be credible. Another witness who reported having seen a dark-colored Dodge sedan near the Lindbergh estate on the morning of the kidnapping was 17-year-old Ben Lupica, who said he saw what appeared to be sections of a ladder inside this vehicle. Lupica also caught a glimpse of the driver, but when he actually took the stand to testify as a defense witness, he could not positively identify Hauptmann, only saying that the driver had a resemblance to him. Nonetheless, the prosecution had 2 other key witnesses, one of whom was Charles Rossiter, who claimed that on February 27, 1932, 3 days before the kidnapping, he came across a stalled car near Princeton Airport, which was located just over 7 miles from the Lindbergh estate. Rossiter said that he pulled over to offer his assistance, but the driver declined his help, and he positively identified this driver as Hauptmann. The prosecution also called upon Cecile Barr, the cashier from Lowe's Sheridan Square Theater, who identified Hauptmann as the man who used one of the ransom bills to purchase a ticket from her on the evening of November 26, 1933. If Barr was correct, then this contradicted Hauptmann's story that he did not find or spend any of Isidore Fish's money until August of 1934. But one potential discrepancy in Barr's story is that she had originally told investigators that the man who gave her the money was American and had no accent, whereas Hauptmann had a very thick and distinct German accent. And of course, Hauptmann's alibi was that he had been celebrating his birthday at a party with his wife and 2 other friends, and it did seem unusual that he would spend his birthday going to a theater by himself particularly since this was only a few weeks after the birth of his son Manfred. When Albert S. Osborne took the stand to testify, he once again shared his expert opinion that Hauptmann's handwriting matched all 14 of the ransom notes, and he was likely the sole author. Photo enlargements of Hauptmann's handwriting samples and excerpts from the ransom notes were displayed in the courtroom so that Osborne could perform a visual comparison, and he described the evidence against Hauptmann as quote-unquote irresistible, unanswerable, and overwhelming. The prosecution would also present 6 other handwriting experts to testify that they believe Hauptmann wrote all the notes. By contrast, the defense was only able to produce one handwriting expert named John Trendley to express his opinion that Hauptmann's handwriting did not match the notes. And while we're on the subject of handwriting, one of the most controversial pieces of evidence at the trial was what appeared to be an address and phone number which were scrawled in pencil on the inside trim above the doorway of a closet in Hauptmann's apartment. Even though the writing was smudged and was not discovered until 5 days after Hauptmann's arrest, it appeared to spell out the words, quote, 2974 Decatur, which happened to be John Condon's address, and the letters and numbers, quote, SEDG 3-7154, which happened to be Condon's phone number. On the surface, this looked pretty damning for Hauptmann, and he really didn't have much of an explanation for it. Hauptmann said that he had a habit of writing down items of interest on his walls, so when the Lindbergh Baby Kidnapping took place, he wondered if he might have seen Condon's address and phone number in a newspaper article about the case and decided to write them down. While Hauptmann acknowledged that he may have written this in his closet at some point, he said he honestly could not remember. As absurd as Hauptmann's explanation may have sounded, there were a few reasons to believe he was telling the truth. For instance, Hauptmann did write random tidbits of information on his walls, and some serial numbers were found scrawled on the door of the same closet, which he claimed were from some money that Isidore Fish had given him to buy stocks, which may have been true, since these particular serial numbers did not match any of the ransom bills. If Hauptmann was the kidnapper, it seemed odd that he would have written Condon's address and phone number inside a dark closet with no overhead light, since he did not have a phone at his apartment. Whenever Hauptmann had to make any calls, he said he always went to use a public payphone down the street, which would have contained a directory with Condon's number listed, thereby rendering it unnecessary for Hauptmann to write down the number at home in the first place. The defense found it suspicious that the police did not notice the address and phone number until days after Hauptmann's arrest, and many years later, allegations would surface that a reporter covering the case may have been the person who wrote them down inside the closet. But I'll talk more about that a bit later. Perhaps the most important witness for the prosecution was Arthur Kaler, who was the chief wood technologist for the United States Forest Service at the Department of Agriculture and was nicknamed the Sherlock Holmes of wood. Kaler was pretty much breaking new ground, as this may have been the first time that a witness classified as a wood technologist had ever testified at a criminal trial, and wood technology was not a science that had been recognized by the courts before this point. Kaler had extensively studied the makeshift wooden ladder which had been used by the kidnapper and left behind outside the Lindbergh residence, and he classified each of the side rails as rails 1 through 16. Kaler was able to determine that on December 1st, 1931, 3 months before the kidnapping, a shipment of southern pine wood with the precise width and thickness of rails 12 through 15 had been sold to the National Lumber and Millwork Company in the Williamsbridge district of the Bronx. And, well, Hauptmann was a carpenter who had once been employed by this company to do contract work, and a sales slip showed that he had purchased $9 worth of lumber from them on December 29th, 1931. In Kaler's eyes, the key piece of evidence was rail 16, the left-hand side rail on the top section of the ladder, as it contained 4 extra square nail holes, which were quite different from the round nail holes on the other sections of the ladder. Kaler testified that these 4 holes formed a unique pattern which could not be duplicated, so he had always theorized that the perpetrator ran out of lumber while constructing the ladder and grabbed an additional piece of wood which was quite different from the rest of the lumber in order to use it as rail 16. Well, on September the 26th, 1 week after Hauptmann's arrest, Lieutenant Louis Boardman of the New Jersey State Police who had worked alongside Kaler during his original search to track down the wood from the ladder, he went up into the attic at Hauptmann's apartment and discovered that it had a floorboard which was shorter than the others and appeared to have been sawed in half. Foreman also noticed some square nail holes in the attic's joists. Kaler used photo enlargements to compare rail 16 from the ladder and the floorboard from the attic, as he said they were both southern pine and had the same milling pattern, as well as similar surfaces on the inside and outside and the same number of annual rings. Kaler believed that the grain on each side of both pieces of wood was identical and showed how the 4 oddly placed square nail holes from rail 16 seemed to line up with the square nail holes in the joists from Hauptmann's attic. Even though rail 16 was not as wide as the attic floorboard, Kaler explained that away by saying that both edges of the rail had been shaved with a hand plane. A toolbox had been removed from Hauptmann's garage which contained a hand plane, as well as 3 chisels which were a 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, and 1.5 inches long, respectively. But interestingly enough, there was no 3/4 inch chisel in Hauptmann's toolbox, and as you might recall, a chisel of that length was found outside the Lindbergh residence near the ladder, and Kaler believed it was used to construct it. To counter Kaler's testimony, the defense produced a professional lumberman named Charles Lindbergh, who performed his own demonstration in which he compared 2 boards whose end grains seemed to match perfectly. But Lindbergh then revealed that these boards came from 2 separate buildings, one of which was 47 years old and the other only 5 years old, which seemed to show that it was possible for 2 different pieces of wood from 2 different sources to have matching end grain. Lindbergh did acknowledge that even though the boards came from 2 different buildings which were vastly different ages, they originated from 2 trees that were the same age, but regardless, he still believed that rail 16 and the attic floorboard each came from 2 entirely different sources. Lindbergh also said that he did not see any marks from a hammer or a nail extracting tool on the floorboard or the joists in Hauptmann's attic, which is why he didn't think the board was removed from there. A millworker and carpenter named Edward Milk also testified for the defense and expressed his doubts that rail 16 and the attic floorboard were from the same piece of wood, since the rings in the floorboard appeared to be darker and there was a noticeable difference in the size and spacing of the knots it had. Other than the allegations of rail 16 having originated from his attic, there was no real physical evidence to place Hauptmann at the crime scene, as none of his fingerprints could be found on the ladder, the nursery, or any of the ransom notes. A footprint which was described as being 12 to 12.5 inches long and 4 to 4.5 inches wide was found in the dirt beneath the nursery window, and while no plaster castings were ever made of the print, Hauptmann's shoes were size 9 to 9.5. Following the ransom drop, a plastic casting had been collected of an 8 to 8.5 footprint at St. Raymond Cemetery from a spot where Cemetery John had leaped from a wall, but this print was never introduced into evidence. In addition, after the kidnapping was reported to law enforcement, the police set up checkpoints at virtually every entrance to New York City, such as the Holland Tunnel and the George Washington Bridge, in order to search every vehicle that drove into the city and record their license plate numbers. There was no record of Hauptmann's license number ever having been recorded that night, but of course, that did rule out the possibility that Hauptmann made it back to New York before these checkpoints were set up. The primary alibi witnesses for Hauptmann would be his wife Anna and his best friend Hans Kloppenberg. Anna stuck to her original story that Richard had picked her up from her job at Frederickson's at around 9 p.m. on the evening of March 1st, 1932. Since the kidnapping occurred during this time period, this alibi could have cleared Hauptmann if it was accurate. The bakery's owner, Christian Frederickson, took the witness stand and testified that he could not swear with any certainty that he saw Hauptmann there on that particular night. And while 3 other witnesses testified that they did recall seeing Hauptmann there, the prosecution argued that since nearly 3 years had passed, they all may have been mistaken about the date they saw him. Kloppenberg testified that he was playing music with Hauptmann at his apartment on the evening of April 2nd, 1932, when the ransom drop with Cemetery John took place. Kloppenberg even provided additional testimony which helped support Hauptmann's story about Isidore Fish. Kloppenberg had attended the farewell party that Hauptmann held for Fish in December of 1933, and said that he recalled seeing Fish show up there while carrying a package under his arm before he went to speak with Hauptmann in the kitchen. This package could have been the shoebox full of money that Fish supposedly left with Hauptmann, but Kloppenberg acknowledged that he could not be certain if Fish still had the package with him when he left the party that night. One of the biggest sources of confusion with Hauptmann's alibis was whether or not he was working on these two particular dates. Hauptmann initially claimed that on March 1st, 1932, he had recently started a new job as a carpenter at the Majestic Apartments located on Central Park West on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. He claimed that he worked until 5 p.m., and since it was a 40-minute subway ride back to his apartment in the Yorkville neighborhood, the chances of Hauptmann being able to drive over 70 miles from the Bronx to the Lindbergh residence in East Amwell Township in order to commit the kidnapping at around 9 p.m. seemed a lot less likely. However, investigators would eventually obtain employment records, which seemed to show that Hauptmann did not actually start working at the Majestic until 3 weeks later on March the 21st. But here's where it gets confusing. Hauptmann had been hired for this job through the Reliant Employment Agency, and when the grand jury proceedings took place, Edward Morton, the timekeeper for the Reliance Property Management Company, was subpoenaed. He was apparently going to present timesheets which showed that Hauptmann did work at the Majestic Apartments on March the 1st, but the company's assistant treasurer, Howard Knapp, showed up instead. Knapp presented timesheets for the second half of March from the 16th until the 31st, but it appeared that the payroll records and the timesheets for the first half of March from the 1st to the 15th could no longer be found. Knapp claimed that Hauptmann had only worked from March the 21st to the 31st, and even produced a paycheck for $36.67, which showed that Hauptmann had been paid for 11 days of work that month, and it even had a signature of endorsement from Hauptmann. Knapp also produced a second check for $6.67, dated from April the 15th, and he said that Hauptmann had been paid for working 2 days in April. Edward Morton would later testify at Hauptmann's trial to corroborate this by presenting timesheets which showed that Hauptmann had worked from the 21st until the 31st. But here's an odd detail about these timesheets which has always raised some red flags. Each employee listed had little ticks on the sheets next to their names to mark the days they worked, but for reasons unknown, Hauptmann had some blobs next to his name for each day between March the 16th and the 21st. None of the other names on the sheet had these blobs next to them, so conspiracy theorists have speculated that the timesheets may have been altered by someone prior to the trial, and these blobs were meant to cover some ticks which showed that Hauptmann actually worked those days from the 16th until the 21st. Now, Hauptmann also initially said that he worked at the Majestic on Saturday, April the 2nd, 1932, the date of the ransom drop, before he returned home and had his music night with Hans Kloppenberg. However, employment records seem to show that Hauptmann didn't report to work on April the 2nd, and the timesheets for that month once again displayed a blob next to his name on that date rather than a tick. Hauptmann then showed up to work one more day at the Majestic on Monday, April the 4th, before he suddenly quit without notice. Hauptmann's explanation for this was that they had promised to pay him $100 per month, but then they changed their mind and said he would only be getting $80 per month. Hauptmann was also disappointed that his supervisor would be shifting him away from carpentry work in order to perform maintenance work, which was not his specialty, and this also influenced his decision to quit. But not surprisingly, investigators found it to be a suspicious coincidence that Hauptmann left his job right after Cemetery John just happened to collect a $50,000 ransom. Well, some sources say that Hauptmann was not employed at all between April of 1932 and his arrest in September of 1934, which is not quite accurate, since he did take on some contract work from time to time. However, he never had a full-time job, but still seemed to live a comfortable lifestyle, which included making some expensive purchases like sending his wife on a trip to Germany. Hauptmann told people that he made a decent amount of money during this time period by investing and trading stocks, but his brokerage account records seem to contradict this, since they showed that he had actually lost thousands of dollars in savings on the stock market during this time period. But Hauptmann insisted that he still made money and kept it hidden at home, and rather than depositing it in any of his accounts, since a number of banks were failing because of the Great Depression. Indeed, financial records did confirm that none of the ransom bills ever showed up at Hauptmann's brokerage or bank accounts. The prosecution attempted to poke a number of holes at Hauptmann's story that Isidore Fish had left him a shoebox containing over $14,000 in cash, as he did not come across as someone who had much money in his possession. In April of 1932, shortly after the ransom drop took place, Fish had rented a room at a boarding house at the low cost of $3.50 per week, but his landlady testified that he could barely afford his rent and showed no signs of having recently come in to $50,000. Throughout the rest of the year, Fish's family sent him money from Germany to help him out financially, and he was known for frequently borrowing money from friends for investments and living expenses. And when Fish came down with tuberculosis, he never went to see a doctor for treatment, as he claimed he could not afford it. Fish's sister testified that she had lived with him in Leipzig during the last months of his life, but claimed that he did not bring anything with him from America besides a few items of clothing, and he only had a couple $100 in his possession when he died. But while this may have been nothing more than a coincidence, one potentially intriguing detail is that Fish applied for a passport to return to Germany on May the 12th, 1932, the very same date that Charlie Lindbergh's body was found. For his part, Hauptmann took the stand to testify in his own defense and claimed that when he was first taken into custody by police to be interrogated, he was beaten to the point of exhaustion. They told him that he would not be allowed to get any sleep until he submitted samples of his handwriting, and after he agreed to comply, they dictated exact passages from the ransom note and told him to copy them. While the police denied these allegations, a doctor's report would later be uncovered, which had been written 6 days after Hauptmann's arrest, and mentioned injuries to his head, back, abdomen, and thighs, which seemed to be consistent with a recent beating. During his closing summation to the jury, Edward J. Riley argued that the evidence against Hauptmann was entirely circumstantial and there was nothing that conclusively placed him at the Lindbergh estate on the night of the kidnapping. Riley brought up the fact that there was no personal connection between Hauptmann and the Lindberghs, who had only been living at their residence in East Amwell Township on the weekends at that point and stayed the rest of the week at Next Day Hill, the estate that was owned by Anne Morrow Lindbergh's family in Englewood. Riley argued that there was no way that Hauptmann could have known that Charlie would come down with a cold and that he and his parents would still be at the estate in East Amwell Township on a Tuesday night, which is why Riley suspected that the kidnapping was an inside job involving multiple people with close ties to the Lindberghs. He brought up the fact that Violet Sharp, a maid who worked at Next Day Hill, had elected to take her own life after being interrogated by the authorities, which Riley felt was compelling evidence that she was complicit in the crime and Hauptmann had nothing to do with it. Riley also made sure to bring up the fact that $30,300 of the ransom money had still not been found or accounted for, and pushed forward the possibility that Isidore Fish may have put it in a safe deposit box somewhere under an assumed name before he died. In total, the trial lasted for 6 weeks, and the case finally went to the jury on February the 13th. Later that evening, after 11 hours of deliberation, they finally reached a verdict and announced that they had found Hauptmann guilty of first-degree murder. Hauptmann was sentenced to death via the electric chair, and his execution was scheduled for the week of March the 18th, so he was transferred to death row at the New Jersey State Prison in Trenton. Hauptmann was immediately granted a stay of execution after his attorneys appealed the verdict to the New Jersey Court of Errors and Appeals, and he had a number of supporters, many of them German Americans, who helped contribute money to his defense fund. Since Richard and Anna were unhappy with Edward Riley's performance at the trial, they agreed to dismiss him as their attorney, and Lloyd Fisher would lead the defense team. The New Jersey Court of Errors and Appeals spent several months reviewing Hauptmann's case, but on October the 9th, they announced that they were upholding the guilty verdict. Hauptmann received an additional stay of execution when another appeal was filed with the United States Supreme Court, but they ultimately declined to hear the case. As a result, a new date was set for Hauptmann's execution, which would occur on January the 17th, 1936. Well, a number of people and media publications, such as the New York Times, openly shared their concerns about Hauptmann's conviction, as they still felt there were some troubling loose ends in the case. One of these people was New Jersey Governor Harold Hauptmann, who decided to pay a secret visit to the New Jersey State Prison and have a private conversation with Hauptmann on death row. On December the 5th, Hauptmann surprised everyone by publicly announcing that he was going to ask New Jersey's Court of Pardons to grant Hauptmann a personal interview in case he decided to plead for his death sentence to be commuted to life imprisonment. Needless to say, Hauptmann received quite a bit of criticism for this, but he said he was remaining open-minded. While all this was going on, Charles and Ann Lindbergh decided that all the notoriety surrounding the case and the lack of privacy would make it too difficult for them to remain living in the United States, so they decided to relocate to the United Kingdom with their son John. They left on December the 22nd by boarding a freighter in New York City under assumed names in order to sail to Liverpool. After they arrived, they went to live with some relatives in South Wales and would not be in attendance for Hauptmann's execution. Before Hauptmann's trial took place, Governor Hauptmann's predecessor, Governor A. Harry Moore, had been approached by renowned investigator Ellis Parker, who wanted to perform his own independent investigation into the case. Parker worked as the chief of detectives of Burlington County, and since he had a reputation for solving difficult crimes, he was nicknamed the American Sherlock Holmes. Governor Moore authorized Parker to look into the case unofficially, since he technically had no jurisdiction, and following Hauptmann's conviction, Parker shared his concerns with Governor Hauptmann, as he seemed convinced that Hauptmann was innocent and that someone else was responsible for the kidnapping. Parker was particularly troubled by the fact that John Condon had initially failed to identify Hauptmann as Cemetery John, and Lindbergh initially wasn't sure that he recognized Hauptmann's voice, but by the time the trial rolled around, both men had done a complete 180 and implicated Hauptmann. It would later come out that when Condon viewed the police lineup and would not pick out Hauptmann, investigators got frustrated and apparently told Condon that he would be indicted as an accessory after the fact if he did not make a positive identification. Parker also thought there were credibility issues with some of the other eyewitnesses who identified Hauptmann at his trial, such as Millard Whitehead, who claimed he saw Hauptmann near the Lindbergh estate on 2 separate occasions in the weeks prior to the kidnapping. Whitehead originally shared this account with police the day after Charlie was taken, but it turned out that he actually recanted it nearly 2 months later and admitted he made the whole story up. However, in October of 1934, following Hauptmann's arrest, Whitehead claimed that a New Jersey state trooper named Joseph Wolf showed up at his home and said that if Whitehead accompanied him to the Bronx to have a look at Hauptmann in a police lineup, he might be entitled to 1/3 of the $25,000 reward which was being offered. Whitehead was then taken to the Bronx County Jail and positively identified Hauptmann as the man he had seen, but he was reportedly shown 2 photographs of Hauptmann beforehand, which may have influenced his decision. It turned out that Charles Rossiter, who had reported seeing Hauptmann standing outside a stalled vehicle near Princeton Airport 3 days before the kidnapping, had only come forward with his story after Hauptmann was arrested and Rossiter saw his photograph in the newspaper. In spite of this, Rossiter initially failed to pick Hauptmann out of a lineup before he changed his mind and identified him as the motorist he saw. And when Rossiter provided a description of this motorist's vehicle, he did not identify it as a Dodge sedan, the vehicle that Hauptmann would have been driving at that time. There were also issues with John Joseph Perroni, the taxi driver who identified Hauptmann as the man who had given him the envelope which he delivered to Condon's address. Prior to Hauptmann's arrest, Perroni had already looked at a number of other potential suspects and said that he was reasonably sure that they were the person who handed him the envelope. So if he had already been mistaken on a number of previous occasions, how could Perroni have been so certain that Hauptmann was the man he saw? When Perroni finally identified Hauptmann in a lineup, Hauptmann was standing between 2 police officers who were considerably taller than him, which may have influenced Perroni's selection. Even though the authorities seemed content to stick with the narrative that Hauptmann was the sole perpetrator, there were troubling details to suggest that multiple people were involved in the crime. For instance, during Condon's phone conversation with Cemetery John, he claimed that he heard the caller speaking to someone in the background and an additional voice shout the words "Stati zitto," which is the approximate translation of "shut up" in Italian. Yet investigators didn't seem to have much interest in identifying this second person. On Saturday, March the 19th, 1932, 1 week after his first meeting with John at Woodlawn Cemetery, Condon was manning the booth at a charity event in which he was attempting to sell violins he had collected in order to raise money for the construction of a chapel. While he was there, Condon claimed he was approached by a middle-aged woman who appeared to be Italian, who told him, quote, "Nothing can be done until the excitement is over. There is too much publicity. Meet me at the depot at Tuckahoe Wednesday at 5 in the afternoon. I will have a message for you." End quote. Well, Condon did go to Tuckahoe Station at 5 p.m. on Wednesday, March the 23rd, but the woman failed to show up, and Condon never found out who she was or what message she wanted to deliver. At that particular point, Condon's name had not been mentioned in the newspapers, and only a small handful of people knew that he was acting as an intermediary between the Lindberghs and the kidnapper, so Condon did not think this mysterious woman would have approached him unless she had some knowledge or involvement in the crime. Prior to the trial, the defense had hoped to present expert testimony from Arch Loney, a wood technician in the Public Works Administration who had questioned Arthur Kaler's findings about the floorboard in Hauptmann's attic, but Loney declined the request to appear because he felt he had inadequate time to prepare and present his findings. Following the trial, Loney paid a visit to Hauptmann's attic to perform some experiments and noticed that even though all of the other floorboards there had 7 perpendicular nails driven into them, the board presented at the trial had 23 perpendicular nails, which Loney felt was convincing evidence that it had never been used as part of the attic. Kaler's counterpoint to this was that the board had likely been the first one to be laid on the attic's floor, which is why it was nailed into place much more than the others. Around the start of the new year, Governor Hauptmann was mailed a letter asking the Court of Pardons to grant clemency to Hauptmann because he was innocent, and most interestingly, the letter was signed J.J. Faulkner. As a recap, back in April of 1933, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had issued an executive order that all circulating gold certificates would need to be turned in and exchanged for Federal Reserve notes by the end of the month. Weeks later, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York discovered $2,980 worth of gold certificates which had been deposited with them, and they all had serial numbers from the Lindbergh ransom money, and the deposit slip was signed by someone using the name J.J. Faulkner. A handwriting expert compared the deposit slip to the letter which was mailed to Governor Hauptmann and initially concluded that they were likely written by the same person, but by the time he submitted his report to the Court of Pardons, he had changed his mind and now believed that the letter was nothing more than a hoax. However, one troubling aspect of the case against Hauptmann is that even though many experts believed that his handwriting matched the ransom notes, the consensus seemed to be that it did not match the handwriting on the signed deposit slip from 1933. So if the mysterious J.J. Faulkner was not actually Hauptmann, then this suggested that at the very least, someone else was involved in the crime. Anyway, after viewing the letter, the Court of Pardons upheld the death sentence, and on January the 16th, Anna Hauptmann paid a visit to Governor Hauptmann and begged him to stop her husband's execution. Hauptmann said that the only chance he had to save his life was to tell the full truth and make a confession to the crime, but Hauptmann steadfastly continued to maintain his innocence. Hauptmann requested a meeting with David Willenz and Anthony Houck, the Hunterdon County prosecutor, and requested a stay of execution since he felt there were too many doubts about Hauptmann's conviction. Willenz and Houck agreed to offer a 60-day reprieve, so Hauptmann's execution was postponed. The following day, Governor Hauptmann issued a statement to the press in which he confirmed that he did not hold a strong opinion about Hauptmann's guilt or innocence, but he felt that at the very least, the evidence showed that the crime may have been committed by more than one person. He requested that Herbert Norman Schwarzkopf, the superintendent of the New Jersey State Police, continue a thorough and impartial investigation in order to ensure that all the parties involved were brought to justice. But Schwarzkopf remained convinced that Hauptmann was guilty and the sole perpetrator of the kidnapping. The New York Evening Journal soon revealed that they had offered to pay Hauptmann $75,000, which would be left to his wife and son, if he provided them with an exclusive confession to the crime, but he still turned the offer down and continued to maintain his innocence. And unfortunately for Hauptmann, the money which was raised for his defense fund had nearly run out, so his team did not have many resources at their disposal to launch a new investigation which could have turned up new evidence. Well, in another bizarre turn of events, Gaston Means, an inmate at the United States Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas, later confessed that he and some other people were responsible for the Lindbergh Baby Kidnapping, and Hauptmann was completely innocent. Means was a former FBI agent and bootlegger who became embroiled in the case in the days following the kidnapping when he got in touch with Evelyn Walsh McLean, a prominent Washington, D.C. socialite and mining heiress who also happened to be the owner of the Hope Diamond. Means had previously done some investigative work for McLean's husband, so he convinced her that he knew the identity of the Lindbergh baby kidnapper. He claimed that they had doubled the ransom demand to $100,000, but if McLean gave him that amount of money, he would use it to get the child back. Well, Means was nothing more than a con artist, and after receiving the $100,000, he disappeared for a few months and kept resurfacing to inform McLean that he needed additional payments of $4,000 and $35,000. McLean eventually demanded that Means return the money to her, but when he refused, she reported him to the authorities, and Means was eventually arrested by the FBI and charged with larceny, embezzlement, and conspiracy to defraud, and he received a 15-year prison sentence at Leavenworth. When Means came forward with his confession, he claimed that Charlie had been kidnapped by an unstable relative of Anne Morrow Lindbergh, who accidentally fell and dropped the baby, but needless to say, no one believed his story. Means wound up dying behind bars in December of 1938, and his confession did nothing to bring a halt to Hauptmann's execution. On March the 27th, 4 days before the execution was scheduled to take place, there was yet another odd development when every member of the Court of Pardons was mailed a copy of a signed 25-page confession from a man named Paul Wendell, who took responsibility for the kidnapping. Wendell wrote that after he abducted Charlie from the nursery, he took the child to a tenement in a slum in Trenton to care for him, but Charlie became ill before he eventually fell out of his crib and fractured his skull. Wendell then proceeded to take Charlie's body to Mount Rose and buried him in a shallow grave in the woods. At the time this confession was signed, Paul Wendell was a 50-year-old former attorney who had a history of troubles with the law, as over a decade earlier he had been disbarred and spent 9 months in jail for perjury, though he was later given a pardon and restored to the bar. In 1931, Wendell was indicted for passing bad checks and embezzling money, but even though warrants were issued for his arrest, he was never captured and was technically still a wanted fugitive by the time this confession arrived. Well, interestingly enough, Ellis Parker was acquainted with Wendell, who was the son of an old friend of his, and 1 week after the Lindbergh baby kidnapping took place, Parker spoke to Wendell about the crime, even though he was still wanted by the law. Wendell offered his assistance to find the missing child, claiming he would seek information from some associates he knew from organized crime, but while this never led anywhere, Parker became suspicious of Wendell's obsession with the case and wondered if he may have been involved in the kidnapping. In fact, when the child was found deceased, Parker was skeptical that the body even belonged to Charlie Lindbergh, and since Wendell apparently agreed with him on this only increased Parker's belief that Wendell knew more about the crime than he was letting on. It was unclear who mailed copies of Wendell's confession to the Court of Pardons, since there was no name or address on the envelope, and Wendell's whereabouts at that time were unknown. Governor Hauptmann and Hauptmann's defense attorney denied having any knowledge about this confession, but Ellis Parker said he could find Wendell. Shortly thereafter, Parker delivered Wendell to the Mercer County authorities, where he was arraigned on the charge of murder, as well as his old embezzlement charges, and held in the Mercer County Jail. Well, when David Willenz and Superintendent Schwarzkopf went to visit Wendell in jail, he denied having any involvement in the kidnapping and maintained that he had been beaten and coerced into making his confession. Wendell claimed that several weeks earlier, he had been kidnapped from the Hotel Stanford in Manhattan by a group of men who drove him to a house in Brooklyn, chained him in the cellar, and proceeded to beat and torture him for about 10 days before he finally broke down and confessed to being responsible for killing Charlie Lindbergh. The kidnappers then drove Wendell to Mount Holly, New Jersey, and dropped him off outside Ellis Parker's house. When Wendell told Parker about what happened, Parker agreed not to contact the police, but instead set up Wendell in an apartment at the New Lisbon Colony, a state mental institution where Wendell voluntarily committed himself. Over the next few weeks, Parker gradually convinced Wendell that if he made another confession to the Lindbergh Baby Kidnapping, he could enter a plea of temporary insanity, and Parker would ensure that he received fair treatment since he was a friend of Governor Hauptmann. In the end, Wendell agreed to this arrangement and signed a 25-page confession that Parker had typed out for him. Copies of the confession were subsequently mailed out to members of the Court of Pardons, and Parker soon delivered Wendell to the Mercer County authorities so that he could be arraigned for Charlie's murder. But of course, Wendell later recanted his confession, and as crazy as his abduction story sounded, parts of it did check out. Wendell's son and daughter claimed that they had been approached by Ellis Parker, who told them that Wendell had confessed to the Lindbergh kidnapping, so he wanted them to write a statement admitting that they had watched over the baby and he died in their care, but they refused to go along with this. They also claimed that Parker showed them a letter from Governor Hauptmann in which he offered leniency for Wendell, but Hauptmann denied ever writing such a letter. Aside from his questionable confession, no evidence could be found to link Wendell to the kidnapping, so the authorities were very skeptical that he was responsible. On March the 30th, Hauptmann's second and final appeal asking for clemency from the Court of Pardons was denied, so Governor Hauptmann announced that this decision would be his final legal action in the case and he would not grant another reprieve. Hauptmann was scheduled to be executed the following evening, but there would be a major complication, as a Mercer County grand jury was in the midst of hearing the case against Paul Wendell and contemplating whether or not to indict him for Charlie's murder. As you can imagine, the idea of executing Hauptmann, when another suspect could potentially be charged for the same crime, was a major legal conundrum, so at the request of the Mercer County grand jury, a decision was made to postpone the execution. During this time period, Hauptmann received a final last-minute offer to have his death sentence commuted to life imprisonment if he made a full confession to the crime, but he once again refused to do so. The grand jury ultimately decided not to indict Wendell for murder, so Hauptmann was executed in the electric chair at 8:44 p.m. on the evening of April the 3rd. Anna subsequently had her husband's body cremated at a private memorial service, and a crowd of around 2,000 people, many of them German Americans, gathered outside. In the weeks following Hauptmann's execution, 5 men were indicted by the Kings County District Attorney for their roles in Paul Wendell's kidnapping, and one of them happened to be Ellis Parker's son, Ellis Parker Jr. The other participants alleged that Ellis Parker Sr. masterminded the whole thing by arranging for them to abduct Wendell and hold him captive and torture him if necessary until he confessed to being responsible for the Lindbergh Baby Kidnapping. The district attorney wanted to indict Ellis Parker Sr. as well, but Governor Hauptmann refused to extradite him or his son from New Jersey to Brooklyn to stand trial. However, Paul Wendell wrote to the United States Attorney General and was able to convince him to convene a federal grand jury who eventually handed down an indictment against the Parkers. After Wendell was kidnapped and tortured in Brooklyn, he had been transported across state lines in order to be delivered to the Parker residence in Mount Holly, so in a truly ironic twist, the Parkers were charged for violating the Little Lindbergh Law. While one of the men involved in the kidnapping died before he could stand trial, 3 of the others were convicted of violating New York State's kidnapping law, and they were each sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. The Parkers both stood trial in federal court in Newark, and after they were convicted of their crimes, Ellis Sr. was sentenced to 6 years in the Federal Correctional Institution in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, while Ellis Jr. received 3 years. Obviously, kidnapping and torturing Wendell was crossing a major ethical line, but Parker still seemed to genuinely believe that Wendell was somehow involved in the kidnapping and felt it was necessary to extract a confession from him in order to prevent an innocent man from being executed. Parker never wavered from this belief before he suffered a fatal brain tumor and died in the prison hospital in February of 1940. Another prominent person from the case who became the center of controversy was Dr. John Condon, as he published a book about his involvement in the case titled Jafsey Tells All, as Jafsey was the code name he had used during his communications with the kidnapper. Condon also put together a vaudeville tour in which he would share his experiences, which led to criticism that he was exploiting the tragedy for his own fame. Condon only made 2 appearances before one of his shows in Plainfield, New Jersey was protested by the local clergy and his tour wound up being canceled. On January 2, 1945, Condon passed away at his home of pneumonia at the age of 84. Some people have suspected that Condon may have played a much bigger role in the kidnapping than simply being a good Samaritan who volunteered his services as an intermediary, but we'll discuss this topic in further detail on a future episode. As for the Lindbergh family, they spent over 3 years living in England and France before they returned to the United States in April of 1939. In addition to their youngest living son, John, Charles and Anne would go on to have 4 more children together, 2 sons named Land and Scott, and 2 daughters named Anne and Reeve. Many years later, Charles would go on to have 7 more children with 3 other women, but this is yet another topic I'll be delving into on next week's episode. After retiring to the island of Maui in Hawaii, Charles spent the last few years of his life suffering from lymphoma before he succumbed to the disease on August 26, 1974, at the age of 72. During the 1990s, Anne wound up suffering a series of strokes which left her confused and disabled, and this required her to experience round-the-clock medical care. The final years of her life were spent living on a farm in Passumpsic, Vermont, owned by her daughter Reeve, before she suffered a fatal stroke on February 7, 2001, at the age of 94. Her daughter Anne had already passed away in 1993, and John Lindbergh died in 2021, but her remaining 3 children, Land, Scott, and Reeve, are still alive today. The Lindberghs never stopped believing that Bruno Richard Hauptmann was responsible for Charlie's kidnapping and murder, but it seems that after Charles passed away in 1974, an innocence movement to posthumously clear Hauptmann's name and prove he was wrongly executed seemed to gain a lot more traction. In 1976, journalist Anthony Scaduto published the book Scapegoat: The Lonesome Death of Bruno Richard Hauptmann, in which he argued that Hauptmann was railroaded and that the authorities either manufactured or suppressed key evidence in the case. Following the kidnapping, Lindbergh initially suspected that his son had been taken by members of organized crime, so he sought the assistance of a shady underworld figure named Morris Mickey Rosner. It's been rumored that Lindbergh gave Rosner the original ransom note and allowed him to circulate copies of it throughout New York City, so even though the note was not released to the public by law enforcement or shared in the newspapers, Scaduto suspected that the ransom notes sent to John Condon were not penned by the actual kidnapper, but rather someone who copied the original author's writing style and exploited the situation in order to extort Lindbergh out of $50,000. Therefore, the mysterious cemetery John was nothing more than a greedy opportunist and had no actual involvement in the kidnapping. In fact, Scaduto was even willing to acknowledge the possibility that Hauptmann really was Cemetery John, but was only guilty of extortion rather than murder and did not deserve the death penalty. Some other new revelations from Scapegoat included an interview between Scaduto and a journalist named Frank Fitzpatrick, who alleged that one of the most compelling pieces of evidence at Hauptmann's trial was fabricated. You might recall that John Condon's address and phone number were found written down inside a closet at Hauptmann's apartment, but Fitzpatrick claimed that Tom Cassidy, a reporter from the New York Daily News, scrawled the address and phone number himself because he needed a new, exclusive story. Cassidy then got his photographer to take a picture of the writing and reported on it, but he reportedly spent years openly bragging to fellow journalists about having done this. Scaduto also managed to uncover a never-before-seen affidavit from Joseph Furcht, a construction supervisor from the Majestic Apartments, who claimed he had hired Hauptmann as a carpenter there on February 27, 1932, and that he worked his first shift at the Majestic from 8 a.m. until 5 p.m. on March 1st, the date of the kidnapping. The affidavit had been taken after Hauptmann's extradition hearing, but withheld from the defense at his trial, though Furcht later made a second sworn statement in which he said he wasn't entirely certain if Hauptmann had worked on March 1st. Records would later be discovered which seemed to indicate that Hauptmann may have shown up at the Majestic to work on the morning of March the 1st, but was sent home after being told there was no more work for him to do, which could explain this discrepancy. In Scapegoat, Scaduto openly expressed a bit of skepticism that the body of the baby found in the woods in Mount Rose actually belonged to Charlie Lindbergh. We'll explore this angle in more detail in future episodes, but this spot happened to be located across the road from an orphanage, so one prominent conspiracy theory is that someone may have dug up the decomposed body of another deceased child and planted it in the woods in hopes that it would be falsely identified as the Lindbergh baby and they could successfully fake Charlie's death. For this reason, over a dozen adults would come forward over the years expressing the belief that they were Charlie Lindbergh and had been raised under a false identity. Perhaps the most prominent of these individuals was Harold Olson, a computer specialist from Westport, Connecticut, who suspected that he was raised by gangsters before he was turned over to his adoptive parents. Olson was interviewed in Scapegoat and noted a number of compelling physical similarities between himself and Charlie, and he did bear a bit of a resemblance to Anne Morrow Lindbergh. Since most of these adult Lindbergh baby wannabes came forward before DNA testing was a thing, I'm not sure if any DNA comparisons were ever performed to officially rule out these people as being Charlie, but these days, the majority consensus seems to be that the baby died on the same night he was kidnapped before his body was abandoned in the woods. Perhaps the most notable aspect of Scapegoat is that Scaduto managed to get an interview with Anna Hauptmann, who was 76 years old by that point and had not spoken publicly about the case in several decades. It appears that the book may have rejuvenated Anna's spirit, as she would spend the next several years trying to clear her deceased husband's name and doing interviews on prominent TV programs like The Today Show. In November of 1980, the Leonard Nimoy hosted TV series In Search Of released a new episode about the Lindbergh kidnapping, which planted seeds of doubt about Hauptmann having been responsible for the crime and featured interviews with Anthony Scaduto. In December of 1982, a new one-hour documentary aired on BBC and PBS titled Who Killed the Lindbergh Baby, which also explored some of the troubling aspects with the case against Hauptmann. After watching the documentary, Günter Haas, one of the leading handwriting experts in Great Britain, decided to perform his own independent analysis of the state's handwriting exhibits. He eventually completed a report in which he listed no less than 30 separate examples where he believed the writing on the ransom notes differed from Hauptmann's handwriting, leading him to conclude that Hauptmann was not the author. One of the individuals who helped put together this documentary was Scottish journalist Ludovic Kennedy, and in 1985, he published his own book about the case titled The Airman and the Carpenter, The Lindbergh Kidnapping, and the Framing of Richard Hauptmann. Much like Scapegoat, this book brought up a number of issues with the case against Hauptmann, and I will be analyzing a lot of their points in greater depth on future episodes. In 1981, Anna, who was 82 years old, obtained the services of a San Francisco-based attorney named Robert Bryan, who filed a wrongful death suit in federal district court in Newark, seeking $100 million in damages against the state of New Jersey and for her husband's original conviction to be overturned. Other defendants in the suit included former New Jersey Attorney General David Wilens, who was still alive at that point, the FBI, and the Hearst Corporation, as Anna alleged that their newspapers engaged in a massive conspiracy with law enforcement to provide biased and prejudicial coverage that painted Richard as guilty before his trial even took place. Former Governor Harold Hoffman had died in 1954, but decades later, several boxes containing his case files about the kidnapping were discovered inside a garage, which compelled Anna to file her lawsuit. In response, New Jersey Governor Brendan Byrne agreed to issue an executive order to release over 90,000 previously unseen documents about the case, which were being held by the New Jersey State Police. Byrne felt these documents were historical in nature and should be made available to the public, though he still expressed his belief that Hauptmann's guilty verdict had been a just one. The documents were now made available to Anna's legal team and would later be housed in the New Jersey State Police Museum and Learning Center in Ewing Township. However, in August of 1983, a federal judge dismissed Anna's lawsuit after concluding that there was little evidence to support its claims that the authorities had railroaded her husband and caused his wrongful execution. Even though Anna attempted to appeal this decision with the United States Supreme Court, they declined to hear her case. In December of 1989, the case would be the subject of another one-hour TV documentary titled Reliving the Lindbergh Case, which is currently available for viewing on YouTube. It once again explored the legitimacy of the conviction and featured interviews with Anna, as well as Richard's former best friend and alibi witness, Hans Kloppenberg. Anna continued to maintain that Richard had picked her up from Frederickson's bakery/cafe on the evening of March 1st, 1932, while the kidnapping was taking place. And Kloppenberg remained certain that he was with Richard at his apartment on the evening of April 5th, 1932, and they were playing music together when the ransom drop with Cemetery John took place. Anna claimed that she was having a conversation with a customer when Richard took the bakery owner's dog for a walk, but even though this woman could have backed up Richard's story, she never testified at his trial. According to Anna, the customer once sent her a letter to confirm that she had seen Richard at Frederickson's that night, but she did not want to come forward and tell the authorities because the witnesses in the case were being treated very badly at that time. Even though Anna said she gave this letter to one of the reporters covering the trial, it wound up disappearing. In 1990, Anna sent a letter to New Jersey Governor James Florio in which she made a last-ditch appeal for a meeting as she hoped that she could convince him to review the new evidence she had uncovered and formally declare her late husband innocent. Anna later received a letter back from the New Jersey Attorney General informing her that Florio had been advised that there was no basis to reopen the case, so the governor was declining her request for a meeting. Anna never stopped fighting to attempt to clear Richard's name before she passed away on October 10th, 1994 in Lancaster, Pennsylvania at the age of 95. She never remarried or had any more children, and her son, Manfred Hauptmann, passed away in January of 2016 at the age of 82, though he left behind 5 children, 7 grandchildren, and 4 great-grandchildren. However, 1 year prior to Anna's death, another new angle about this case was presented when authors Gregory Algren and Stephen Monier published a book titled Crime of the Century, The Lindbergh Kidnapping Host, which pushed forward the idea that a ransom kidnapping never actually occurred and the whole thing was an elaborate hoax orchestrated by none other than Charles Lindbergh in order to cover up his own complicity in his son's death. But I'm afraid I'm now going to have to leave you on yet another cliffhanger and bring this episode to a close. Next week, we're going to explore some of the troubling aspects of Charles Lindbergh's life and the possibility that he may have been responsible for his son's death, as at least 2 major theories have been presented for this. We're also going to explore a book which was published in 2012 by author Robert Zorn titled Cemetery John, the Undiscovered Mastermind of the Lindbergh Kidnapping, in which he alleges that Hauptmann was involved in the kidnapping, but was also part of a conspiracy involving some other German-born accomplices besides Isidor Fisch, who wound up getting away with it. The rise of the pro-innocence movement for Hauptmann has also led to the publication of some additional books which have re-explored the evidence against him and reaffirmed the conclusion that he was guilty all along, so we're going to address this as well. Next week, in part 3 of this series, we will explore all the new theories which have been presented about this case over the past few decades, and then for our final chapter, part 4, I will perform my own personal analysis and share my own thoughts about what I believe happened. But in the meantime, if you have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now, the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 8 years, our Patreon page has released over 90 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released an episode about the 1988 murders of the Jordan children, which involved 5 members of the same family being killed when their house was set on fire, and no one was ever brought to justice for the crime. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discuss the 2008 disappearance of Brandon Swanson. And for our patrons Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we have over 80 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Stevie M and Alexa. Thank you all so much for your support. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composed the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So have yourselves a great week, and be sure to join us next Wednesday as we present part 3 of our 4-part series about the Lindbergh Baby Kidnapping on our special 10-year anniversary episode of The Trail Went Cold.